Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Love Was by A interview. I'm joined by the amazing Meg Caddy today to talk all about Slipping the Noose, the sequel to Devil's Ballast. So I absolutely love these ones. They're just good pirate adventure fun. Consumed both of them over separate weekends. Very easy to do. So Meg, can you tell us, just to start, a little bit about where Devil's Ballast ends and where Slipping the Noose starts?
Okay, so without being too spoiler heavy, in case anyone hasn't gone through Devil's Ballast yet. So Devil's Ballast pretty much ends where we know history kind of takes us. So through Anne Bonny's story of her life at sea, and it ends before that all comes to an end. And the beginning of Slipping the Noose is really where history kind of drops the ball and loses track of Anne, which is, so she and the crew are captured, and Anne is essentially left on her own in a very difficult situation. And all we know from history is that she wasn't executed. Which is a big deal because a lot of the people involved in her story are executed. And there were lots of different historical stories that I read about what might have happened to Anne. And there are a lot of people who are very, very convinced that they are descendants of Anne Bonny. But I couldn't find anything concrete historically to support any of that. And I also hated a lot of those stories because a lot of them have her going back to Charleston. She marries a friend of her father's. She's very rich. She has, some stories have her having like 16 babies. And I couldn't stand it. I just thought, this is not, even if this is what happened to Anne Bonny, it's not fair that that's what happened to Anne Bonny. So I really wanted to write kind of an alternate ending for her, something that I think she would approve of a little more.
100%. I really think that she would. So did you always know that you were going to write a sequel?
Well, yes, because I wrote the sequel first.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, so initially, I was reading these stories about what had happened to Anne Bonny, and I just got real mad about it. And so I started writing Slipping the Noose, and I sent it off to my editor at Text, and she said, look, this is great, I love it, but this is a sequel. This is a second book, and you need to write the first book now. And actually writing Devil's Ballast was a lot trickier than writing Slipping the Noose because there were more concrete historical events that I had to tie it to, more eyewitness accounts, more like a better known story, really. So I put Slipping the Noose aside and then wrote Devil's Ballast and then came back and rewrote Slipping the Noose. So yeah, I always knew there was going to be a sequel.
Yeah, I love that so much. Oh my gosh.
You're backwards.
Yeah, and you're just sitting on that for so long. It's finally here now.
A long time.
Amazing. Okay, then. This kind of throws around my questions because I feel like this is so opposite now.
Sorry, I messed things up.
How dare you ruin it? I'm joking. So then I did want to ask you a little bit about the research because I sort of had thought like, you would have done so much research for the first book. Did you already have like a pretty firm grasp on characters and the world and stuff for Slipping the Noose? Did you have to do any, well, I guess now I want to ask, did the draft change much from what it initially was? And did you have to do any additional research for it?
It did, because really the only thing that sort of stayed the same in Slipping the Noose from sort of the first draft to now was Anne kicking about in London and ruining everything.
Yep. I'm glad that stayed in there.
Characters stayed the same, mostly. I always knew that Ned Fletcher was going to be in there. He was always, he's so different to Anne, and he's such he's not a pirate by any means.
No.
But I'm really fond of him. For me, he's quite he really holds the story together for me. So I always knew that Ned was going to be in there. And the research is kind of an interesting thing, because a lot of the research I did in London for Slipping the Noose and Devil's Ballast at the same time.
Okay.
So knowing that I was going to write Slipping the Noose, I was sort of walking the streets that I knew were involved in Slipping the Noose, making sure that I marked out how long it took to get between one place and the other place, that sort of thing. But I was also going to the Greenwich Maritime Museum, going to Kew Gardens for the National Archives, speaking with piratologists, that sort of thing, to research for Devil's Ballast. So a lot of the research was kind of done concurrently. And it was actually really nice to be able to sort of jump from these bright, brilliant waters of the Bahamas to London, which is a very different creature. And being aware that I was going to have to write that contrast. So in 2017, I went to the Bahamas and Charleston and then London. And wherever I went, I took a photo of the water. So we stayed in a harbour there because we were living on a boat. So I was taking photos of the waters in the harbour, and then waters in the actual open ocean, and then in the Bahamian Ocean, and then the River Thames as well. So having it sort of in mind that I was going to write books, both books, was really helpful, because it meant that I could focus on that contrast and really try and draw it out a little bit more, you know?
Yeah, and you know, it really, really works, because the thing that really sticks in my mind with Slipping the Noose is like the color brown. Like the Thames felt like its own character, and just like dirty London, and it was just like smoke-filled London, and it was extremely different. But I think it really becomes like, yeah, its own character, and it really stands on its own.
I was trying to characterize the river as being quite different from the ocean. And I actually have sort of character profiles for different bodies of water, and also for so nerdy. Also for every different ship or vessel or boat, they all have a different character profile as well.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to make sure that every boat they went on was different, because Anne would see them as being very different.
Yeah, I was just about to say, I think it's Anne's reactions that make it feel so alive. Like, she still feels that kind of pull towards the water and ships and boats, but she's just like, this is so different still, and she can't quite get her head around it. That's very cool. Well, it definitely came across. So I loved it. I'd love spending time in what was like late 1700s London, and all their fears of fire. You know.
yeah, that was well, I mean, that was part of it though, was sort of walking through London and seeing the path the fire had taken. Particularly in the area that's focused on in Slipping the Noose. That's right in the heart of it. That's right where the fire was. So that was something that was really, you know, even though it's sort of, you know, Slipping the Noose is set in the 1720s, and the Great Fire of London was in the 1660s. But even then, there were still remnants of it everywhere in London, and it was still very prevalent in people's minds. My wonderful grandfather, my late grandfather, my papa, he really helped me with a lot of the research, and so he taped a lot of documentaries about the Great Fire and then how it was seen in London and all that sort of thing. So it was very helpful.
Oh, that sounds fascinating. I'll have to look it up, because I know that the monument's there. I've seen the monument. But yeah, I don't really know much else about it. But yeah, I loved how real it felt during that time. But just going back a little bit to how different these books are, and I don't think this is too much of a spoiler, because it's pretty much on the back cover of Slipping the Noose. But obviously we start off, things are very, very different. Like, Calico's gone and has a baby, and it's just so different from where we left them in Devil's Ballast. What was the decision to sort of have such an abrupt cutoff between stories?
That's a really good question, actually. I think part of it was, again, because Slipping the Noose was written first. So Slipping the Noose always began with Anne at her very lowest point, where she's just lost everything. and all she has is this little baby, and there's a lot of grief and complicated emotion wrapped up in the baby as well. And Anne's not the most maternal figure in the world. You know, she's her first child was she gave to the Cunninghams in Cuba. So she I wanted it to start at a point where Anne was completely out of her depth and in a place that she'd never been before, and without having like a big group of, you know, boisterous pirates behind her to back her up. And the thing with Anne is she's a very resilient person. And so part of that is part of writing about her is kind of putting her in these difficult situations and watching her bounce back in inventive ways, seeing how she can sort of think around the problem because she can't muscle her way out. So I always wanted Slipping the Noose to start at a very low point for her, but I also wanted it clear from the beginning that she's still going to think her way around it, and she's still going to find ways to strike out on her own. And sometimes that's kind of to the detriment of her mental health. You know, she doesn't really let herself grieve when she needs to, because she goes straight on to the next plan. And that's kind of something that Slipping the Noose is. It's also a journey of her grief, and she forestalls it for as long as she possibly can.
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny because it pulls, well, I found for me, pulls the reader in to be with her. Like you kind of start off with that, like, oh my, what's going on? Everything's gone to shit since like I finished the last book, but you have no choice but to like hold on and just see what happens next and just see how it goes. And yeah, so I really loved that we kind of went through that with Anne.